Hi, I'm Norman Beer from Carnegie Mellon's Open Learning Initiative. So there's been plenty that you've already heard about the past and the present of open education, so I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the future of open education. Technology has always been one of the major drivers of OER. That ability to replicate without cost has been foundational for OER to exist, for it to succeed. So a lot of us continue to look at technological affordances to provide other mechanisms for transforming education. When I talk to faculty and ask how technology can be transformational, I get a couple of different types of answers. Some continue to argue that technology can let students learn anytime or any place. Other faculty are very insistent that technology allows us to provide rich simulations in labs to students. And finally, others in the OER space continue to insist that access is the most important thing that technology provides. This ability to provide access to learners to high quality materials can be transformational. I think all of these affordances are important, but at OLI we have focused on a different potential for technology, and that is in its ability to collect and apply data. So web-based courseware gives us an ability to embed assessments into every student learning opportunity and to leverage the data that's captured from these interactions to fundamentally improve learning. We can use these pieces of data to drive better hints and better feedback to our learners. We can also use it to offer faculty more information and cues, let them know where their students are struggling and where they're succeeding. More broadly, we're able to interpret this data in ways that let us continuously improve the design of our courses. And when we aggregate this data and send it back into the research community, we're also able to further advance our understanding of how humans learn. So it's worth noting that collecting and using this learning data is controversial, all the more so given some recent data abuses and breaches as I'm recording this video. And in the face of this, I'm hearing calls from some of our community leaders for stronger solutions to the data problem. Some of these range from really locking down the data in better ways. Others are actually insisting that we should be renouncing the collection of learning data entirely. I think this is a really important conversation, that it's not the one that I want to talk about right now. Personally, I think we're already in a world where data-driven approaches and materials are being developed, adopted, and embraced. They're being used by vendors, they're being used by schools and faculty, we're seeing them promoted by foundations, we're seeing them demanded by some aspects of the government. And so, in many ways, our data-driven future is already here. And let's be clear, some of these approaches have actually demonstrated an amazing potential to improve outcomes, to lower costs, and to enable new approaches and pedagogies. I think it's reasonable for the optimists among us to look at these approaches as an opportunity to move the needle in education, particularly among vulnerable learning populations. But I also think that this raises some real concerns, in that in the open community, we see this as giving publishers a new and sudden opportunity to reconsider their business models, to start to think about offering these types of data-driven services as subscription services, just at a time when we see real progress being made on opening up content and on opening up education. I've also got a concern that's a little more direct. So the effective use of data-driven approaches absolutely rely on instrumented content. That is, content that can provide meaningful assessments of student learning. It's also going to rely on systems that can capture and store that data. It relies on the algorithms that can analyze and make sense of that learner data. And it's going to rely on displays and dashboards that can make that analysis actionable and understandable. I think that the private sector is way out ahead of us in building these kinds of systems and the courseware that drives them. And I'm worried that open education is getting left behind in this race as we continue to emphasize the development of static open content. And as we cease to have the kinds of systems that are able to leverage what instrumented content is open. So even as we're seeing this broader recognition and use of OER, even as we feel like we're on the cusp of a new moment in the open community, we also see the publishers moving up market into data-driven systems, leaving us with a real risk of open ending up as a second-class solution, and as our OER consumers ending up as second-class citizens. This is particularly galling when you know that some of these vendors are populating their systems with open educational resources. So if vendors are going to be the primary drivers of this approach, it's also going to leave us with the continuing danger of vendor lock-in, that all of the data and content that's driving these systems ends up being locked into proprietary systems that you're not going to be able to get access to if you decide to use a different system or if the vendor goes out of business. But I'm also really worried that in this model, the algorithms and models become secret black box systems, and with no visibility into the ways that the data is being analyzed or the ways that these predictions and recommendations are being made, we and our learners are going to become increasingly dependent upon systems that we don't understand and that might not even be making particularly good suggestions or recommendations. Beyond the lack of direct visibility into these systems, and by that I mean the ability to look at the code, there's also remarkably little secondary visibility. I think that the research on the efficacy of these systems has been very spotty, and I think too often what's presented to us as evidence is actually marketing materials masquerading as research. We've seen a few examples of what's appeared to be rigorous research into analytic systems turn out to be just wrong. And so, absent transparency into the systems that are going to be powering some of the most popular analytic systems, we've seen some educators try to understand those systems by investigating their inputs and outputs, and then trying to reverse engineer the underlying systems. It's uncomfortable to see some of their results where what claim to be very sophisticated statistical models can oftentimes be fairly closely replicated simply by using simple leveraging approaches. So by itself, this should all be enough to make the case for the open education movement to set its sights on establishing and using fully open analytic systems, systems that are powered by fully open models and algorithms. And at a basic level, these kinds of open systems can guarantee that open education is able to compete with and avoid being exploited by closed and proprietary approaches. Equally important, these kinds of open systems would avoid the data lock-in problem, and by establishing clear standards for data use and portability, such systems are actually likely to force vendors to also provide more options on their side for porting data and understanding how it's being used. More importantly, though, I think that an open approach to these types of systems provides full transparency into the workings of the algorithms and models that are driving recommendations. And I think this is absolutely essential to understanding these systems, and it's essential to making informed decisions on how you might leverage and interpret the recommendations that these systems make. So, equally important to me, this type of transparency is going to be essential for any type of scientific exploration of these algorithms and models, for us to understand how or if they work. Engaging in the difficult work of refining them and of making them more useful demands transparency. And perhaps most importantly, the ability to investigate the assumptions that are implicit in the algorithms and models that we use is also going to demand transparency. And this is really an important point, because we've seen time and time again that the implicit biases of developers are going to find their ways into algorithms. Whether these are the algorithms that power social media systems or even the software that drives automatic hair dryers, we see these biases at work. I'm going to borrow a phrase from Audrey Waters and note that our algorithms are not neutral. And while I can make every effort to identify and compensate for my biases as I develop my own algorithms, we have to recognize that, sort of like the bulk of an iceberg, the bulk of our implicit biases are hidden from our own view, by definition. When I'm developing a model that's going to identify and predict learning, it's pretty likely that I'm going to prioritize and privilege the patterns and behaviors that look like learning to me, and that I'll de-emphasize motivations and actions that don't align quite as well with my own experience. And look, as proud as I am of the work and experiences that have led me to Carnegie Mellon, I'm under no illusions that these necessarily represent the types of common experiences and motivations that we should be basing our larger understanding and models of learning. They certainly don't represent the only ways that we should think about and approach learning. So if none of us can fully identify and avoid our own biases, we must have systems that allow for a broadened exploration and identification and remediation of these biases. And the transparency that is inherent in the open approach is the best way that I know to ensure that this work can happen. So I believe that the next battle for open education is in the data-driven education space. And I think that the creation of open systems, of open algorithms and models, and the creation of the instrumented OER that can drive it is absolutely critical. And I think there's some real urgency in making progress on this dimension. I'm a little worried that too much of our attention as the open community continues to be on the development of static open textbook-like materials. And while we've been focused on other things, proprietary solutions have been making an enormous inroads in claiming this data-driven space as their own. So, a quick note for those of you that are watching this as part of the edX Open Education MOOC. There's been some great research that suggests that videos like this one are probably one of the worst ways for you to learn. Much more effective would be for you to engage in richer learn-by-doing activities. And in the face of that, I'm pretty hopeful that the Wiley and Siemens team are going to have some great activities lined up for you. But just in case they don't, I've got some homework for you. Take a quick look around Google and identify some of the leading options for learning analytics and data-driven instrumented courseware. Who's providing this stuff? What can you say about the efficacy of the solutions they're offering? Do you have any clarity at all on how their algorithms operate? So now, see what you can find on current work in the open analytics and open learning model space. Who's doing the most interesting work? Are any of the systems out there adoptable? And if not, why not? What needs to happen before there are practical open solutions in place? If you have a moment, take a look at some of the online conversations that are getting started in response to the new Creative Commons Open Education platform. Cable Green at Creative Commons, I think, has been particularly outspoken in promoting the need for open systems in this space. Do you see this reflected in the platform's current conversations? Finally, maybe most importantly, take some time to read an essay from Audrey Waters entitled Identity, Power, and Education's Algorithms. From this, make a list of the kind of biases you can imagine creeping into the kinds of algorithms we're talking about. Which ones are most concerning? How can an open approach best mitigate those concerns? So I hope you found this interesting, and I hope that maybe you still have some questions, some comments, or even some expressions of absolute outrage and disbelief. If so, let me know. You can find me on Twitter. I am @NormanBeer. Thanks.